I left my in-laws' house with a single suitcase and nothing else. No jewelry, no savings, not even the wedding photo that had hung in the hallway for 5 years. Behind me, the door closed quietly, as if I had never belonged there at all. My mother-in-law believed she had finally removed the burden from her son's life. My husband, he just stood there and watched me go, his silence louder than every insult they had thrown at me that night. They thought they had taken everything from me. But the next morning, when the elevator doors opened on the top floor of the company they were celebrating, and I walked into the boardroom they believed belonged to them, every face in that room slowly turned pale, because the woman they had thrown out with nothing was the one who owned the entire company. And the worst part? My husband was about to realize what his silence had just cost him. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. I had lived in my husband's parents' house for 5 years, yet somehow I always felt like a guest who had stayed too long. No one ever said it directly at first. It was hidden in the small things, the way conversations quietly shifted when I entered the room, the way my mother-in-law's eyes drifted toward my empty hands whenever the company came up in conversation, as if she were searching for proof that I had contributed nothing to the life her son was building. That evening looked no different from any other. The dining table was polished until the wood reflected the warm yellow light above it. 4 plates were placed neatly in their usual spots. My father-in-law had opened a bottle of wine to celebrate a new business deal the company had just secured. My mother-in-law kept smiling at her son across the table, the kind of proud smile people reserve for someone they believe has conquered the world. "Our son built something remarkable," she said, lifting her glass slightly. I watched the wine swirl in mine but didn't drink. Across the table, my husband gave a modest smile. He had always been good at that smiling, just enough to accept praise without correcting it. In 5 years, he had never once told them the truth. My father-in-law leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Investors are calling every day now," he said. "Expansion, partnerships, new markets opening. This company is just getting started." Then his eyes moved to me. "And you," he added, the edge in his voice barely hidden beneath the polite tone. "What have you been doing lately?" It was a simple question. It never felt like one. I set my fork down beside my plate, just helping where I can. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother-in-law laughed softly. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough that the room seemed to shrink around it. "Helping," she repeated. "With what exactly?" The sound of her knife touching the porcelain plate rang out when she set it down. "You've been in this family for 5 years," she continued, folding her napkin slowly, as if she had rehearsed the gesture. 5 years, and I still don't know how to explain to people what you actually do." I kept my hands resting in my lap under the table. The clock on the wall ticked steadily behind us. I focused on that sound instead of the 3 pairs of eyes now watching me. My husband stared at his plate. My father-in-law cleared his throat. "Your mother has a point," he said carefully. "Our son built a company that people respect now. Reputation matters. Image matters." My mother-in-law leaned slightly forward in her chair. "And a man in his position should have a wife who contributes something real, someone people can look at and understand why she belongs at his side." Her gaze settled on me again. "But every time someone asks about you..." She paused and shook her head. "I never know what to say." For a moment, I wondered if my husband would finally look up, if he would say something, anything. He didn't. The room stayed quiet long enough for the wine in my glass to stop moving. Then my mother-in-law reached beside her chair and placed a thin stack of papers on the table. The sound of the folder touching the wood was soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade. She slid it slowly across the table until it stopped in front of me. "Key D," she said calmly. I looked down at the document. Divorce papers. When I finally lifted my eyes again, she met my gaze without hesitation. "You don't belong in this family anymore." For a moment, no one moved. The folder lay open in front of me, the papers inside perfectly aligned, as if they had been prepared long before I even sat down at that table. The word divorce rested neatly at the top of the page, and beneath it, paragraphs of legal language quietly dismantled 5 years of marriage. I didn't reach for the pen yet. My mother-in-law leaned back slightly in her chair, watching me with the calm patience of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. "This will be easier for everyone," she said, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth with 2 careful fingers. My father-in-law lifted his wine glass but didn't drink. "No need to make this complicated," he added. "No lawyers arguing for months. Just sign and move on." Move on. The phrase sounded strangely light for something meant to erase an entire life. I turned the first page slowly, the paper making a dry, quiet sound under my fingers. There was a section about property, another about financial responsibility. The house remained with the family. The company was listed clearly as my husband's professional asset. My name appeared only where it absolutely had to. Across the table, my husband remained silent, his attention fixed somewhere between his hands and the surface of the table. My mother-in-law watched me read, her gaze steady, almost clinical. "You should understand the situation," she said after a moment. Her tone was calm, measured, almost polite. "Our son's life is changing now. The company is growing. Investors are paying attention. People notice things." Her eyes flicked briefly to the papers in front of me before returning to my face. "And when a man reaches this level," she continued, "the woman beside him needs to bring something into that picture." The words settled over the table like dust, no one bothered to wipe away. My father-in-law nodded once in agreement. "Image matters in business," he said. "People watch everything." I kept reading even though there was nothing left in the document that could surprise me. My mother-in-law leaned forward slightly, resting her folded hands on the table. "But every time someone asks about you," she said quietly, "I never know what to say." The room grew very still. I closed the folder halfway and placed my hands loosely in my lap beneath the table. "You can take your personal belongings," she continued after a pause. "Clothes, anything you owned before the marriage." Her eyes drifted slowly around the dining room, as if mentally separating what belonged to the house and what did not. "But nothing from here," she added. Her voice softened just a little, though the meaning did not. "That wouldn't be appropriate." My father-in-law shifted in his chair and stretched his shoulders, as though the most difficult part of the evening had already passed. "Everyone will be better off this way," he said. For a brief moment I looked at my husband. I waited, giving the silence a chance to break. One sentence from him would have been enough, one interruption, one objection, anything at all. But the space between us remained untouched. He simply reached for the glass of water beside his plate, took a slow sip, and set it back down again. The soft tap of glass against wood echoed through the quiet room. My mother-in-law noticed the movement and gave a small nod, as if it confirmed something for her. "You see," she said gently, "even he understands this is the right decision." I lowered my eyes to the table again. The pages inside the folder were still waiting. My father-in-law picked up a pen and slid it across the table toward me. It rolled once before stopping beside the document. "All that's left," he said calmly, "is your signature." The pen rested there between us. For a long moment I simply looked at it, then slowly lifted my eyes toward my husband again. The room waited quietly. No one at that table expected an explanation from me. They weren't interested in what I might say. They were only waiting to see one thing, whether I would sign. The pen lay between us on the table, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for this moment long before I walked into the room. My mother-in-law watched me with quiet certainty, her expression calm in the way people look when they believe the outcome has already been decided. My father-in-law leaned back slightly in his chair, relaxed now that the conversation had reached what he clearly considered its natural conclusion. Across from me, my husband sat motionless, his attention fixed somewhere on the table in front of him. I reached for the pen. The movement was small, but every eye followed my hand. The metal felt cool between my fingers. For a brief second, I looked at the signature line waiting at the bottom of the page, my name printed neatly beside the space where 5 years of marriage were expected to end. My mother-in-law released a slow breath. "This is the best decision," she said calmly. "For everyone." I lowered the pen to the paper. The tip touched the page with a faint scratch that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Then I signed. Not slowly, not hesitantly, just one steady motion across the line. For the first time that evening, something shifted in the room. My mother-in-law blinked, clearly surprised by how quickly it had happened. My father-in-law leaned forward slightly, glancing down at the page as if confirming the ink had truly settled where it was supposed to. "Well," he said after a moment, sounding faintly pleased. That was easier than expected. I placed the pen back beside the folder, my hands steady. My mother-in-law gathered the papers together and tapped the edges neatly into place. "I appreciate you being reasonable," she said. "It saves everyone unnecessary trouble." Across the table, my husband finally lifted his eyes and looked directly at me. Something uncertain flickered in his expression, as if he had expected resistance or at least hesitation. Perhaps he thought 5 years of marriage would slow my hand, even for a moment. But the decision had already been made. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The legs scraped lightly against the floor, drawing their attention again. "I'll pack my things tonight," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I had imagined it would be. My mother-in-law nodded once. That would be best. She didn't ask where I would go. My father-in-law had already reached for the wine bottle again, pouring himself another glass, as if the evening had simply returned to normal. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom I had shared with my husband for the past 5 years. The house felt strangely quiet behind me, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. Inside the room, everything looked the same as it always had. The dresser stood against the wall, clothes hung neatly in the closet, and on the nightstand rested the framed photograph from our wedding day. In the picture, we were both smiling. I looked at the photo for a moment before opening the closet and pulling out the small suitcase I had brought with me when I first moved into this house. It had been pushed into the corner and forgotten there for years. Packing didn't take long. A few dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, some documents. Everything that truly belonged to me fit easily inside the suitcase. When I closed the zipper, the sound seemed louder than it should have in the quiet house. I carried the suitcase back down the hallway. The dining room lights were still on, and my in-laws remained at the table, speaking quietly to each other until they noticed me approaching. My husband stood this time. "Where will you go?" he asked. It was the first thing he had said to me all night. I paused near the doorway and looked at him. "That doesn't concern you anymore," I replied. The words lingered between us, but he didn't respond. I walked past him, through the living room, and toward the front door. Outside, the night air felt colder than I expected. I set the suitcase beside the steps and reached into my pocket for the house key. For a moment I held it in my palm, feeling the cool metal against my skin, then went back inside just long enough to place it on the kitchen counter. The key touched the surface with a soft, final sound. No one followed me. No one tried to stop me. When I stepped outside again and closed the door behind me, the latch clicked quietly into place. Inside that house, they believed they had just removed the most useless person from their family. What none of them understood was that by the next morning, everything they thought belonged to them would begin to fall apart. The night air felt colder once the door closed behind me. I stood on the front steps for a moment with my suitcase beside my feet, staring at the quiet street as if it belonged to someone else's life. The house behind me still glowed with warm light through the windows, the same light that had welcomed me 5 years earlier when I first carried that suitcase through the door as a new bride. Back then I believed I was entering a family. Tonight I walked away from it without anyone trying to stop me. I lifted the suitcase and walked toward the curb where my car was parked exactly where I had left it earlier that evening. When I placed the suitcase into the trunk and closed it, the dull thud of metal sounded louder than it should have in the still neighborhood. For a second, I rested my hands on the edge of the car and looked back at the house. Nothing moved inside. No one came out. It was exactly the kind of ending my mother-in-law preferred, clean, quiet, and without a scene. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the headlights stretching across the empty street as I slowly pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it disappeared behind a row of dark trees, and only then did I allow myself to breathe a little deeper. The road ahead was nearly empty, streetlights passing one by one above the windshield while the engine hummed softly beneath me. I didn't turn on the radio. Silence filled the car, broken only by the steady rhythm of tires rolling over asphalt. My phone sat in the cup holder beside me, and the screen remained dark. No messages, no missed calls, nothing at all. After 5 years of marriage, leaving had taken less than 10 minutes. I drove for a while before turning into the parking lot of a small hotel near the office district, a place ordinary enough that no one from my husband's family would ever think to look for me there. The lobby was quiet when I walked in, the receptionist barely glancing up as she handed me a key card. My room was on the third floor. When the door closed behind me, the silence in the room felt different from the one I had left earlier that night. This one belonged entirely to me. I placed the suitcase on the bed and sat beside it for a moment, staring at the blank wall across the room while headlights from the highway outside briefly swept across the curtains and faded again. 5 years. 5 years of watching the company grow while everyone believed the success belonged to someone else. In the beginning, it had been nothing more than an idea scribbled across a notebook page. My husband had enthusiasm, confidence, and a talent for speaking to people, but the company needed something quieter to survive structure, numbers, strategy. Late nights at the kitchen table, spreadsheets glowing on my laptop while the rest of the house slept. Business plans rewritten again and again until every projection finally made sense. Investor presentations prepared in silence, contracts reviewed line by line before they were signed. I had done all of it without ever needing my name attached to the results. And over time, everyone simply accepted the version of the story they preferred, that my husband had built the company himself. Earlier that evening, my mother-in-law spoke about reputation and image as if she understood everything about the business her son was running, and in her mind, the company belonged entirely to him. She had never questioned it. None of them had. My phone vibrated suddenly on the bedside table, the sound cutting through the quiet room. I reached for it and looked at the screen, pausing when I saw the name there. It wasn't my husband. It wasn't anyone from his family. It was the company's legal counsel. The phone continued vibrating in my hand, and I already knew why he was calling. Tomorrow morning, the board of directors would be meeting, and for the first time in years, I intended to walk into that room myself. The phone continued vibrating in my hand for a few seconds before I finally answered it. I didn't need to ask why he was calling. "Good evening," the familiar voice of the company's legal counsel said on the other end, calm and steady in the way lawyers always sounded when they already understood the situation. "I assume you're aware of tomorrow's board meeting." I leaned back against the headboard of the hotel bed, my eyes drifting toward the window where the faint glow of highway lights occasionally brushed across the curtains. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'll be there." A brief silence followed, not awkward, but measured, the kind that comes from years of professional conversations where very little needs to be explained out loud. "I've prepared the documents we discussed," he said. "If you plan to attend the meeting in person, the board will need to review them." I knew exactly which documents he meant. For a moment, my fingers traced the edge of the suitcase beside me, and my mind drifted back 5 years earlier, long before the company's name carried any weight with investors or competitors. Back then, the business had been nothing more than an idea and a small office space with peeling paint, borrowed desks, and a handful of hopeful conversations about what the future might look like. My husband had always been the face of it, confident, persuasive, and full of energy when speaking to people. But enthusiasm alone didn't convince banks or investors to risk their money. What convinced them were numbers, legal structures, and guarantees that protected the company if things failed. At the beginning, when the company was still fragile and largely unknown, the legal paperwork placed the majority of the shares under my name. It had been a practical decision at the time, part of a financial arrangement meant to secure early funding and protect the company from certain risks. My husband had treated it as temporary, something that would eventually change once the business became stable. His parents never paid attention to those details at all. To them, the company belonged to their son, simply because he was the one standing in front of people talking about it. I had never felt the need to correct that assumption. "Are you certain you want to move forward tomorrow?" the lawyer asked gently, his voice bringing me back to the present. Outside the window, a truck passed along the highway, its headlights briefly illuminating the room before fading again. I considered the question carefully. For 5 years, I had allowed a very convenient story to grow around the company, a story where my husband appeared to be the sole architect of everything that had succeeded. It had been easier that way. Easier for his parents, easier for him, and at the time, even easier for me. But tonight, after sitting at that dinner table and signing the papers they placed in front of me, the silence I had kept for years no longer served any purpose. "Yes," I said finally. "It's time." The lawyer didn't ask anything else. "Then I'll see you in the morning," he replied before ending the call. The room fell quiet again once the line disconnected. I placed the phone on the bedside table and leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling while the faint hum of traffic drifted in from the highway outside. Earlier that evening, my mother-in-law had spoken confidently about reputation, about how a man running a successful company needed the right image beside him. In her mind, the divorce papers had simply removed a problem before it could damage her son's future. The thought almost made me smile. The company's reputation had never been the issue. The real problem was that no one in that house had ever bothered to read the documents that defined who actually owned the business they were so proud of. As the room slowly darkened and the city outside settled into the quiet rhythm of late-night traffic, my mind returned to the boardroom where tomorrow's meeting would take place. They believed they were gathering to discuss the company's next stage of growth, new investments, expansion plans, perhaps even leadership changes as the business grew larger. None of them realized the meeting would begin very differently. By this time tomorrow morning, every person sitting at that table would finally understand the one fact my husband's family had ignored for years. The company they believed belonged to their son had never truly been his. Sleep came slowly that night. Long after the lights in the hotel room were turned off, I lay awake staring at the faint outline of the ceiling while the distant hum of traffic drifted in from the highway outside. Every few minutes, headlights swept briefly across the curtains before disappearing again, leaving the room dim and quiet. My thoughts kept circling back to the same place, the boardroom where the meeting would take place in the morning. For years, I had stayed away from that room, allowing others to sit at the table while I remained in the background, watching the company grow into something much larger than the uncertain idea it once was. At the time, it had seemed easier that way. My husband enjoyed standing in front of people, speaking confidently about plans and expansion, and his parents preferred the version of the story where their son had built everything himself. I had allowed that story to exist because challenging it never seemed necessary. But lying there in the quiet hotel room after walking away from the house earlier that evening, I realized how strange that silence looked now. My mother-in-law believed she had solved a problem by forcing me out of the family. In her mind, the divorce papers had simply cleared away someone who didn't belong beside a successful businessman. She had no idea that by signing those papers, she had also pushed away the one person who understood the structure of the company better than anyone else in that house. I turned slightly on the pillow and glanced at the soft glow of the digital clock on the bedside table. It was nearly 3 a.m, and sleep still hadn't arrived. After a moment, I sat up, pulled the laptop from my suitcase, and opened it on the bed. The screen illuminated the dark room, revealing the familiar folders and files I had organized years ago. Financial models, early contracts, legal agreements, records from the first fragile months when the company had barely been more than a startup with borrowed desks and uncertain investors. I opened one of the older files and studied the scanned document that had quietly shaped everything that followed. My name appeared clearly across the top, listed as the majority shareholder and the person responsible for the company's initial financial framework. At the time, the detail had seemed almost routine. The business was small, the risks were high, and the ownership structure had been arranged partly to secure funding and protect the company during its earliest stage. My husband had treated it as a technical arrangement that would eventually change once the company became stable. His parents had never paid attention to it at all. And as the years passed and the company expanded, that original structure remained exactly as it had been written. Investors came, contracts grew larger, and the company's reputation spread through the industry. Yet the documents that defined who actually owned the business were never rewritten. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back against the headboard, letting the quiet return to the room. In just a few hours, the board of directors would gather in the conference room overlooking the city. They would arrive expecting a normal meeting, the usual discussions about growth projections, market expansion, and future strategy. My husband would likely walk in confident and composed, still believing that the events of the previous evening had resolved a personal inconvenience in his life. His parents would probably feel relieved that the issue they had identified was finally gone. None of them had looked closely enough at the paperwork to understand what would happen when the meeting officially began. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, I was already dressed and standing near the window watching the city wake. Cars were beginning to fill the streets below as people started their day, unaware that a quiet corporate drama was about to unfold several blocks away. I picked up my phone and checked the time again. The board meeting would begin soon. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning to remain invisible. Today, I would walk into that room myself, and when the meeting started, The directors would discover that the woman my husband's family had dismissed so easily was the one person in the company whose signature still carried the most authority. Morning traffic had already begun to fill the streets by the time I left the hotel. The city moved with its usual rhythm, people crossing intersections with coffee cups in their hands, buses stopping to release streams of commuters, sunlight reflecting off rows of glass buildings. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. Yet as I drove toward the office district, I felt a steady calm settle over me. For years, I had watched the company grow quietly from the background, letting others stand in the center of the story while I remained out of sight. Today would be different. The company's headquarters stood near the end of the block, a tall glass building reflecting the pale blue of the morning sky. I parked in the underground garage and stepped out of the car, the distant echo of footsteps and elevator chimes drifting down from the lobby above. Employees were already beginning their workday, walking through the entrance with laptops and folders in their hands, but no one paid attention to me as I crossed the garage toward the elevator. To them, I was simply another visitor. The elevator doors closed and began their quiet climb toward the executive floor. I watched the numbers change one by one above the door, each floor bringing me closer to a room I had deliberately avoided for years. When the doors opened again, the hallway outside the executive offices looked exactly as I remembered, thick carpet softening every step, glass walls reflecting the pale light from the large windows at the far end of the corridor. At the end of the hall, the boardroom doors were already open, and low voices drifted into the hallway. I walked inside. Most of the directors had already arrived and were seated around the long conference table with folders and tablets in front of them, speaking quietly while waiting for the meeting to begin. At the head of the table sat my husband. When the door opened, he looked up automatically, expecting someone else from the executive team. For a brief moment, his expression remained neutral. Then recognition set in, and the color drained from his face. The conversations around the table gradually faded as several directors turned to see what had caused the sudden silence. I closed the door behind me and walked calmly toward an empty chair near the center of the table. My husband straightened slightly. "What are you doing here?" he asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. I placed a folder on the table before answering. "I'm attending the meeting." Several members of the board exchanged puzzled looks. Some of them recognized me from years earlier, while others clearly did not. My husband rose halfway from his chair, his confusion quickly turning into irritation. "This meeting is for the board and senior leadership," he said sharply, as if the explanation should be obvious. Across the table, one of the older directors glanced between us with a slight frown. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Before my husband could respond, the boardroom door opened again. The company's legal counsel stepped inside carrying a thin stack of documents. He paused briefly, taking in the room, before walking to the table. "Good morning," he said in his usual calm tone. My husband turned toward him immediately. "What's going on?" he demanded. The lawyer placed the documents neatly in front of him and began distributing copies around the table. "Before the meeting begins," he said evenly, "there is a matter the board should review." One by one, the directors accepted the papers and began scanning the pages. The room fell quiet except for the soft sound of documents shifting across the table. At first, the directors simply read in silence. Then one of them looked up, confusion deepening in his expression as his eyes moved slowly from the document in his hands toward me. "What exactly does this mean?" he asked. The lawyer folded his hands calmly on the table. "It means," he replied, "that the majority shareholder of this company is present in this room." My husband turned toward him immediately. "That's impossible," he said. But no one else spoke, because at that moment every pair of eyes in the boardroom had shifted toward me. For a few seconds, no one in the room moved. The lawyer's words seemed to settle over the long conference table like a weight that no one quite knew how to lift. Every face had turned toward me, waiting for someone, anyone to explain what had just been said. My husband was the first to break the silence. He gave a short, incredulous laugh, the kind people use when they assume something must be a mistake. "That's ridiculous," he said, glancing between the lawyer and the documents now spread across the table. "There has to be some kind of misunderstanding." One of the directors, a gray-haired man who had joined the board years earlier when the company began expanding, lowered the paper in his hands and looked toward the lawyer. "Are these documents verified?" he asked carefully. The lawyer nodded once. "They are. They were filed at the time of the company's incorporation and remain legally active. The director's eyes moved back toward me while several others began reading more carefully, turning pages with growing focus. Confusion slowly shifted into something heavier as the meaning of the documents began to settle in. My husband reached for one of the copies and scanned it quickly, his eyes moving down the page before returning to the top, as though he expected the words to rearrange themselves. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. "These shares were never—" His voice stopped mid-sentence when he noticed the signature line again. Then he looked up at me. "You knew about this?" he asked. I met his gaze without raising my voice. Of course I did. The room remained quiet except for the faint sound of paper shifting across the table. One of the senior directors leaned back in his chair, studying the document with a careful expression. "If this structure is accurate," he said slowly, "then she holds the controlling shares of the company." The lawyer gave a calm nod. "That is correct." Another director looked up immediately. "Since when?" The answer came just as calmly. "Since the company was incorporated." That single sentence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. Several directors glanced again at the dates printed at the bottom of the agreements. The signatures were there, clear and unmistakable, attached to documents that had been filed years before the company's growth attracted investors or industry attention. My husband pushed his chair back slightly, gripping the edge of the table while his eyes moved between the papers and my face. "This was temporary," he said quickly, the confidence in his voice beginning to thin. "We arranged the ownership that way in the beginning for financial reasons. Everyone understood that." I tilted my head slightly. Did they? For a moment he had no answer. Around the table the directors exchanged brief looks. One of them cleared his throat. "Are you saying the ownership structure was never revised?" he asked the lawyer. "There is no record of any transfer of controlling shares," the lawyer replied evenly. "Legally, the majority ownership remains exactly where it was placed in the original agreement." The room grew still again as that explanation settled over the table. My husband stared down at the document in his hands, his fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. "That doesn't change how the company has been run," he said after a moment, though his voice carried far less certainty than before. "I've been managing the business for years." One of the directors nodded slightly. "No one is disputing that," he said. "But management and ownership are two very different things." The distinction seemed to land harder than anything else that had been said. For a moment my husband remained completely silent. Then he slowly raised his eyes toward me again. The disbelief that had filled his expression earlier had faded into something more complicated. "You planned this," he said quietly. I folded my hands together on the table. "No," I replied. "I simply stopped pretending those documents didn't exist." Several members of the board shifted in their seats, their attention moving back and forth between us as they began to understand that the meeting they expected to hold that morning had already changed direction. One of the older directors leaned forward at last, resting his hands on the table while studying me with renewed interest. "Well," he said slowly, glancing once more at the documents before returning his gaze to me, "perhaps we should hear directly from our majority shareholder." For a moment after the director spoke, the boardroom remained completely silent. The attention in the room had shifted fully toward me, and I could feel the weight of it from every side of the table. Only minutes earlier, the directors had expected a routine meeting about growth projections and expansion plans. Now they were looking at the documents in front of them, as if they were reading the company's story for the first time. I remained seated for a few seconds longer, allowing the silence to settle before slowly standing. The movement drew every eye in the room. "I'm not here to cause confusion," I said calmly, my voice steady in the stillness of the boardroom. "And I'm not here to rewrite the company's history either. Most of what you believe about this company is true." Several directors leaned forward slightly, listening more carefully now. "My husband built the public face of this business," I continued. "He spoke with investors, negotiated partnerships, and led the conversations that helped the company grow. No one here would deny that." Across the table my husband said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on me, the tension in his expression growing sharper with each sentence. "But companies rarely survive their early stages because of one person alone," I added. "Especially not in the beginning." I rested one hand lightly on the folder in front of me. When the company was first created, it had almost nothing, no reliable revenue, no market position, and very little investor confidence. What it did have were projections, financial models, and a legal structure designed to protect the business during its most fragile stage. Several of the directors glanced again at the documents the lawyer had distributed. "That structure placed the controlling shares in my name," I said simply. At the time, it wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was a practical decision that allowed the company to secure its first round of funding and move forward. One of the directors cleared his throat slightly. "And that arrangement was never changed?" he asked. "No," I replied. The answer was simple, but it seemed to settle heavily across the room. For years, that fact had existed quietly in the paperwork no one had thought to examine closely. My husband shifted in his chair, his frustration finally breaking through. "That's because it was never supposed to stay that way," he said quickly. "We agreed the ownership would be transferred once the company stabilized." I turned my head toward him calmly. "Did we?" The question hung between us. He didn't answer immediately, and several directors exchanged quiet looks across the table. The atmosphere in the room had changed again, the earlier confusion now replaced with careful attention as everyone began to understand the significance of the documents in front of them. One of the senior board members finally spoke again. "Regardless of what may have been discussed informally," he said slowly, "the legal agreements appear to be very clear." The lawyer nodded once. "They are." My husband looked from the lawyer to the directors and then back at me, the control he usually carried in this room slipping slightly. "So what exactly are you trying to do here?" he asked. His voice carried more frustration now than authority. I met his gaze evenly. "Nothing," I said quietly. The single word seemed to catch him off guard. "I'm not here to take anything away from the company," I continued. "I'm here because the board deserves to understand the ownership structure of the business they're helping manage." Several directors nodded slowly. "This company has grown far beyond the uncertain startup it once was," I added. "But the foundation it stands on hasn't changed." My eyes moved briefly across the table, meeting the faces of the people who had guided the company's expansion. "For years, I allowed a simpler version of the story to exist," I said. "A version where my role remained invisible because it seemed easier for everyone involved." I paused for a moment before finishing the thought. But silence can create misunderstandings. My husband's expression hardened slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked. I closed the folder in front of me and rested my hands lightly on the table. "It means," I said calmly, "that from this moment forward the board should understand exactly who holds the controlling shares of this company." No one spoke immediately. The statement settled heavily across the room while the directors absorbed its meaning. Finally, one of them leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me. "If that's the case," he said carefully, "then the board may need to reconsider how certain decisions are made." And for the first time since the meeting began, my husband looked as though he understood that the situation was no longer entirely under his control. For several long seconds after the director finished speaking, the boardroom remained quiet. This silence was different from the earlier moments of confusion. It carried a slow, careful realization that something fundamental about the company's structure had just been placed in front of them. The directors were no longer reading the documents with curiosity, they were studying them with the focused attention of people recalculating the balance of power in the room. My husband remained standing beside his chair, the document still in his hand, his eyes moving from one face to another as if expecting someone to dismiss the entire situation as a misunderstanding. No one did. One of the senior directors finally set the papers down and folded his hands together on the table. "If the ownership structure is exactly as these documents indicate," he said slowly, "then the board needs to acknowledge that before continuing this meeting." A few quiet nods appeared around the table. My husband shook his head, forcing a small smile that didn't quite hold. "Nothing about the company's operations has changed," he said quickly. "I'm still running the business," another director answered in a calm tone. "Management and ownership are two different things." The distinction settled heavily over the room. My husband turned toward me again, frustration now visible in the tightness of his expression. "If this is about the divorce," he said, "we can handle that privately." I kept my voice even. "This isn't about the divorce. The board deserves to understand how the company is actually structured." Several directors exchanged brief looks. One of them leaned slightly forward in his chair. "Then perhaps the real question," he said thoughtfully, "is how involved you intend to be going forward." The question hung in the air. For a moment, I considered the faces around the table, the people who had spent years guiding the company's growth, believing they understood exactly how the leadership structure worked. "I didn't come here to dismantle anything," I said. "The company has grown because many people in this room have done their jobs well." A few of the directors nodded faintly. My husband let out a short breath. "You've been absent from this business for years," he said. "Now you walk into the boardroom and expect everyone to suddenly treat you as the person in charge?" Before I could answer, the lawyer spoke quietly. "Legally speaking, majority ownership carries authority whether the shareholder has exercised that authority or not." The reminder shifted the atmosphere again. One of the directors looked down at the document in front of him and then back toward me. "Which means," he said carefully, "the board should probably understand what you intend to do with that authority." Every person at the table seemed to turn toward me at the same moment. I let the question sit for a few seconds before answering. "The company is strong," I said calmly. "It has good leadership and experienced directors guiding it. I have no interest in disrupting that progress." My husband watched me closely now, as if trying to predict where the conversation was going. "But there is one thing that will change," I continued. The room grew still again. "From this point forward," I said, "the board will no longer operate under assumptions about where the final authority of this company rests." No one spoke immediately after that. The directors absorbed the statement in silence, understanding that it carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Finally, the same senior director leaned back slightly in his chair and looked toward the rest of the board. "In that case," he said slowly, "we may need to reconsider certain leadership decisions before moving on with today's agenda." My husband turned toward him sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting?" The director did not answer right away. His gaze moved briefly from my husband to me, then back to the rest of the board, and in that moment it became clear to everyone in the room that the meeting they had expected to hold that morning was no longer the meeting that was about to happen. The director's words lingered in the air for a moment after he finished speaking. The atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted again, moving away from surprise and into something quieter but far more serious. The directors were no longer reacting to the revelation, they were evaluating it. Around the table, several of them studied the documents again with the careful attention of people reassessing the structure of the company they had spent years guiding. My husband remained standing beside his chair, his posture stiff, the papers still held in his hand. His eyes moved slowly from one director to another, as if waiting for someone to dismiss the entire situation and return the meeting to normal. No one did. One of the senior directors finally placed the document down and folded his hands together. "If the ownership structure is as clear as these papers indicate," he said calmly, "then we need to acknowledge that before continuing with the meeting." A few of the other directors gave small nods of agreement. My husband shook his head slightly, forcing a thin smile that failed to hide the tension in his face. "You're all acting as if something dramatic has happened," he said. "Nothing about the company's operations has changed. I'm still the CEO." Another director answered in an even tone. "No one is disputing that you've been managing the company," he said, "but the board still has a responsibility to recognize the company's ownership structure." The words were spoken without hostility, but they carried weight. My husband turned toward me again, frustration now clearly visible. "If you have something you want to say," he said sharply, "then say it." I met his gaze calmly. "I already have." The simplicity of the answer seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. "So what is this?" he asked. "Some kind of power move?" A quiet murmur moved across the table as several directors exchanged brief looks. Before the conversation could become more heated, the senior director lifted a hand slightly, signaling for everyone to slow down. "Let's keep this productive," he said. "We're discussing corporate structure, not personal grievances." His attention shifted toward me again. "From the board's perspective, the important question is whether the majority shareholder intends to take a more active role in the company moving forward." The question settled over the table. I took a moment before answering, aware that the response mattered not only to my husband, but to every person sitting in that room. "This company has grown because of the people here," I said. "That hasn't changed." A few of the directors nodded faintly. My husband gave a short breath of frustration. "You've been absent from the business for years," he said. "Now you appear in the boardroom and everyone suddenly has to rethink how the company operates?" Before I could respond, the lawyer spoke quietly. Legally speaking, majority ownership carries authority, whether that authority has been exercised previously or not. The reminder shifted the room's attention again. One of the directors looked down at the papers before raising his eyes toward me. Which means the board should understand what role you intend to play from this point forward. Every face turned toward me again. I let the question sit for a moment before answering. The company is stable, I said calmly. It has strong leadership and experienced directors guiding its decisions. I have no interest in damaging that. My husband watched me closely, trying to read what would come next. But there is one thing that will change, I continued. The room grew still again. From this point forward, I said quietly, everyone involved in the company, including the board, will operate with a clear understanding of where the final authority of this business actually rests. The words settled across the table. The directors absorbed them without interruption, recognizing the quiet finality behind the statement. After a moment, the senior director leaned back in his chair and looked toward the rest of the board. In that case, he said thoughtfully, before we continue with the agenda, there may be a larger question we should address. My husband's attention snapped toward him immediately. What question? He asked. The director did not answer right away. His gaze moved briefly between me and my husband before returning to the rest of the table. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that the next decision made in that boardroom might determine who truly led the company from that day forward. For a moment after the director spoke, the boardroom remained still. The unfinished question lingered across the long table, and everyone present seemed to understand that the meeting had moved far beyond its original agenda. My husband leaned forward slightly, his voice tightening. What question? He asked again, unable to hide the frustration beneath his composure. The director answered calmly. Whether the company's current leadership structure truly reflects the interests of its controlling shareholder. The words settled quietly but carried undeniable weight. Several directors shifted in their chairs, exchanging thoughtful looks. The discussion was no longer about a surprising document or a forgotten technical detail. It had become a conversation about the future of the company itself. My husband let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. You can't seriously be questioning the leadership of a company that's performing better than it ever has, he said. The results speak for themselves. No one is ignoring the results, the director replied, but governance still requires clarity. The distinction was subtle, yet it changed the direction of the room completely. My husband turned toward me, his expression tight with disbelief. So this is what you wanted, he said. You walk in here with a legal technicality, and suddenly the board is rethinking everything. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the table at the directors who had helped guide the company's growth over the years. These were people who cared far more about the company's stability than about the tension between two spouses sitting across from each other. This company matters to me, I said quietly. My husband shook his head. You've stayed away from it for years. I've stayed quiet, I replied. There was a difference, and everyone in the room seemed to understand it. One of the directors spoke again. The board isn't interested in personal conflict, he said carefully. We're interested in understanding the intentions of the majority shareholder. All eyes turned toward me again. I took a slow breath before answering. I didn't come here to dismantle anything, I said. The company has grown because the people in this room have worked hard to build it. Several directors nodded slightly. But there is one thing that needed to change, I continued. For a long time, the story of this company has been simplified. It was easier that way. My husband's eyes narrowed as he watched me. But last night, I said calmly, that simplicity ended. The room grew very quiet again. I was told very clearly that I no longer belonged in the life built around this business, I continued. That may have been a personal decision, but the company itself was never a personal possession. A few directors leaned forward slightly, listening. This company was built on agreements, I said. And this company was built on agreements, I said, and those agreements still exist. I folded my hands lightly on the table before finishing the thought. When I left that house last night with nothing but a suitcase, I said quietly, I realized something important. No one interrupted. I may have walked away from the family, I continued, but I never walked away from the company. The meaning of the words settled slowly across the room. One of the directors looked thoughtfully toward the rest of the board before speaking again. Then perhaps the most important thing for us to understand, he said, is what role you intend to take moving forward. I met his gaze calmly. My role hasn't changed, I said. The foundation of the company is exactly the same as it has always been. My husband stared at me now, the certainty he once carried in this room completely gone. And that means, I finished quietly, the person they forced out of the family yesterday is still the person who owns the company today. The boardroom fell silent again, but this time the silence carried clarity rather than confusion. Around the table, the directors understood something that my husband was only beginning to grasp. The decision made at that dinner table the night before had removed me from his life. But it had not removed me from the company he believed belonged to him. This story is not really about money or corporate power. It is about respect, assumptions, and the consequences of underestimating the quiet strength of someone who has been standing beside you all along. There are several real-life lessons that many people, especially in family, marriage, and business, can take from it. 1. Never underestimate the person who helped build your success. In many relationships, especially long marriages, one partner's contribution is often invisible. One person may be the public face, while the other quietly carries the weight behind the scenes, handling, planning, strategy, stability, or emotional support. Just because someone is not standing in the spotlight does not mean they are not holding the foundation together. The moment you forget that, you risk losing the very person who made your success possible. 2. Silence does not mean weakness. The narrator stayed quiet for years. She didn't argue, compete for credit, or demand recognition. Many people misinterpret that kind of silence as submission or dependence. In reality, silence can sometimes come from patience, confidence, or simply the belief that recognition is not necessary. But when that silence is mistaken for weakness, the truth can eventually arrive in a way that shocks everyone. 3. Respect in a marriage is more valuable than status or image. The mother-in-law in the story cared deeply about reputation and appearances. She believed that removing her daughter-in-law would improve her son's image as a successful businessman. But respect inside a family cannot be replaced by reputation outside it. When respect disappears from a marriage, everything else, wealth, status, or success, becomes fragile. 4. Never make decisions based on arrogance or assumptions. The husband and his family assumed they understood the entire situation. They believed they controlled the company, the marriage, and the outcome. But their confidence was built on assumptions, not facts. In real life, arrogance often blinds people to details that eventually become very important. 5. Legal agreements and real foundations matter more than appearances. In business and often in life, the real power is not always visible. Titles, public recognition, or leadership positions may look impressive, but the true structure of ownership and responsibility often exists quietly in contracts, agreements, and long-term planning. What appears powerful on the surface is not always where the real authority lies. 6. The way you treat people during difficult moments reveals who you really are. The dinner scene where the narrator was asked to leave with nothing showed the true character of the family. Difficult moments often expose what everyday politeness hides. The way we treat people when they seem vulnerable often determines how those relationships will end. 7. Losing respect can cost more than losing money. At the end of the story, the husband did not just lose control of the company, he lost something far more valuable: trust, partnership, and the person who had quietly supported his success for years. Some losses cannot be fixed by apologies or negotiations. The most important lesson: never assume you know someone's true value just because they chose to stand quietly beside you. Sometimes the person you think has nothing is actually the one holding everything together.